Putin continues to drive deeper Western support for Ukraine with his brutality and indiscriminate aggression. Now, France, Germany, and the US are sending tanks and Patriot batteries. This could signal a real step up from the supply of defensive weaponry to offensive. Has the West finally realized that to end the war requires a resounding Ukrainian victory on the battlefield? Russia is rumored to be on the cusp of drafting 500,000 more conscripts. But will Putin break the fragile consensus within Russia with his increasingly desperate and ineffective measures? Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you like the topics we cover, then please subscribe to help boost the popularity of our materials in YouTube. Today, I'm speaking to James Bruno. He writes commentary on foreign affairs and national security and is the author of 4 best-selling books. He's been interviewed on CNN, NPR, Fox News, BBC, SiriusXM Radio, and other media. He is a contributing writer with Washington Monthly and has contributed to Politico Magazine, HuffPost, Cipher Brief, The Weekly, and other publications. Mr. Bruno served as a diplomat with the US Department of State for 23 years, and he holds MA degrees from the US Naval War College and Columbia University, with a BA from George Washington University. And I should point out as well that this is James's second chance to be on the podcast, and I'm extremely grateful that he agreed to come back despite our earlier conversation.
Well, it's great to be here, Jonathan. Thanks for inviting me back. I'm flattered.
Well, I mean, the first conversation was absolutely fascinating, given your experience. And what really caught my eye was your recent posts on LinkedIn, because I believe you've been to Georgia and you've been getting a frontline view of how the Russian so-called refugees, I'm not sure what word to actually label them, but the Russian sort of draft dodgers are heading to Georgia in their tens of thousands. And you've been sort of observing how that process is going, haven't you?
Yes, I I traveled to Georgia in November, and I wanted to explore the impact of these Russian draft dodgers, who are estimated to number approximately 120,000 now in that country, out of at least 500,000 who have fled Russia. I wanted to dig into the impact on Georgian society, but also how the Russians themselves are faring. And I found it fascinating. First of all, I have to say at the outset that the Russians are not popular among Georgians, but that goes back historically as well as to today. There's a lot of lingering resentment among Georgians, as there are in other ex-Soviet republics, to Russian dominance. But in the case of these men, they're overwhelmingly young, they're very educated, and they're just trying to escape from Putin's so-called mobilization. In any case, I have to say they're generally despised among Georgians. One, historically; two, because these people, first of all, they're in large numbers in a very small country of under 4 million. So you see them everywhere, on the streets, in the shops, and so on. Basically, Georgians complain that they say these Russians come here and they act as if they still own us. And so even though Georgians are now, I believe Georgian students have to take 2 years of mandatory Russian in school, which gives them a basic facility in the language. They hate speaking it. And so whenever Russians come into a shop, and I saw this with my own eyes, and they'll speak Russian, they won't. The Georgians complain that they don't make the effort to even learn a few phrases, words of Georgian, which I did, by the way. It's an impossible language, but I made the effort, which went far. In any case, they'll speak Russian, and the Georgians love to say, I refuse to speak Russian back to them. And one young lady told me whenever a Russian addresses me in Russian, I always answer in English in order to mess with their mind. So it's this kind of tension. But I have to say this: I look very I delved quite deeply into how these Russians are impacting society, and I have to say they're behaving themselves. They are not. Georgians told me that the Russians are not a burden on social welfare as a rule. They tend to bring their work with them. They're many of them are digital nomads, so they who are often have technical vocations, so they are able to carry on their jobs wherever they are outside of Russia. And they generally are behave themselves and and in fact, many of them go out of their way to try to build bridges with Georgians. They're fully cognizant of the fact that they are guests in the country. So I would say there are no serious tensions between the groups, but Georgians do worry about the long-term impact of having over 100,000 Russians in their midst. Could they become a permanent community? They don't want to become like the Baltic states, where they're stuck with a sizable population of ethnic Russians who then possibly could be manipulated by Moscow at some point. So they have that in mind as well. So it's fascinating. I also traveled to the Russian border in two spots, one South Ossetia, and two further to the east, northeast, right up to the border with Russia. And I wanted to go there just to get a flavor of what the situation is in the border regions. In the South Ossetia, it's quite tense. I wouldn't say that there's any danger of a flare-up, but nonetheless, the Georgians Georgian population is terribly upset over the fact that Russia in 2008 invaded and occupied 20% of the country, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and set up these puppet republics. And in the northeast border area, it was interesting. I visited a huge monument to Soviet-Georgian relations that was put up in the 1980s, back when Georgia was still a part of the Soviet Union. And actually, artistically, this monument, which is on a mountain, is actually in good taste. It's quite artistic and informative. But the Georgians hate it. They'd like nothing better than to mow it, to blow it up or bulldoze it over, only because of the symbolism. And so it's sort of like a testament to tyranny that among the Georgian population. But they don't touch it because they do not want to antagonize the Russians more than they need to. Unlike, again, in the Baltic states, where they're still blowing up statues of Russian heroes and Soviet heroes.
That's accelerated, hasn't it? Like in Poland and the Baltics, they're really going for them.
And in the Czech Republic as well, but not in Georgia. They're being careful about that. But in any case, the thing that really struck me, and I was very surprised about when I went to those two border areas, is the amount of trade that's going on. Now, Georgia has not joined in with the sanctions regime of the West, so trade flows freely. In both regions, I saw literally hundreds of tractor trailers, cargo trucks, lined up on the side of the road, often having to wait a week or 10 days to cross into Russia or South Ossetia. And because the reason for the backup is bureaucratic red tape, basically. But I looked at the license plates and the advertising on the side of the trucks, and they were a mix of nationalities ranging from regional, a lot of Armenian. The Armenians are very entrepreneurial in transportation. A lot of Armenian transport, but Azerbaijan, some Iranian, but also I was surprised to see a lot of German trucks. And I wondered what that was all about. So in any case, these trucks were lined up for miles and miles on these highways waiting to get into Russia. So the indication to me is that trade is going on robustly in that area. Maybe because in the West and Eastern Europe and so on, and Scandinavia, the trade has pretty much come to a halt.
So through Finland and through the sort of the NATO borders, obviously that trade has slowed to a trickle, and the air and train freight has all but ceased. Obviously there's stuff through from Kaliningrad and places, but people I've spoken to who have actually been in Moscow, and one of them includes a sort of journalist correspondent who was there. He said superficially, you can't see much impact, at least in the larger, richer centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg. People are going to restaurants, the shops have most of the products that you'd need. It might be swapping out some sort of Western brands with Chinese or wherever, but what you're seeing there suggests that trade is finding a way to circumvent the sanctions.
Yeah, and this is where we get into a discussion of the sanctions, because my premise has always been that sanctions take years to work. I'm afraid Western media tend to look for quick results and things like this. When I was in the State Department, I worked on Afghanistan for years. That back when the country was invaded and occupied by the Soviet Union. And we saw the same kind of thing play out back then, albeit the Soviet Union did not have as a prosperous consumer culture as it does today. In any case, we had sanctions against the Soviet Union back then, but also the combat that was taking place inside Afghanistan was taking a toll. But it took years for that to have an effect on Russian society, Soviet society. And in the end, in that war over a decade, the Soviet Union lost over 10,000 killed in action, plus probably 3 times that wounded in action and missing. And it was in the final stages of that period that Russians were feeling the pain and registering their pain. And I always like to refer to the Committee of Mothers of Soldiers, which is still strong and going. They're an independent group, mothers of men serving actively in this Russian army. Back then, in the 1980s, they took to protesting, and it was one of these embarrassing things. Like we saw a similar thing in Argentina during the military dictatorship there, when you had mothers meeting in the plazas and protesting, and the regime really not knowing how to deal with them because they did not want to be seen as beating up middle-aged women. In any case, it took years for the effects of sanctions and the body count to have an impact broadly on Soviet society. And I see the same thing basically playing out today. So that in less than a year, the Russians have suffered over 100,000 casualties. Think of it. In the Vietnam War, in the Vietnam War, roughly 14 years in the United States, we lost about 52,000 KIA in Vietnam. And believe me, I was around then as a student, a child and a student, and I remember the impact that had, even on my small community where I was raised. And that had catalyzing impact on American society, on the anti-war movement. So we're seeing 100,000 casualties in Russia in this war today. How long can that go on, that kill ratio go on without Russians starting to react against it?
And then there's another aspect, James, isn't there? Because, at the moment, we know that Putin doesn't have any scruples about dealing with the mothers. We know the FSB is already arresting them and threatening them. So they're kind of nipping that one in the bud. But there is a longer term follow-up, isn't there? When people come back and they're maimed, they're disabled, they're injured, they have psychological problems, they have no jobs to come back to. And many of them will be actually bringing back with them ordnance, weapons, offensive weapons, or they'll have networks that can actually get hold of those through contacts they made in the army. There was an extraordinary spike in the crime rate post-Vietnam. And already, I believe from some of my guests that we're seeing an extraordinary violent crime wave kicking off in Russia already.
Well, not only that, but also a wave of drug addiction and alcohol addiction. People see this on the streets. My colleagues who served in Russia, again in the old days, recall seeing Russian veterans just sort of flopping around the streets, drunk or addicted, committing crime and this kind of thing. In any case, it's bound to have an impact broadly. Not only that, but then we get into the question of ethnic minorities in Russia. There are also parallels with America and Vietnam, I have to say. But so the disproportionate number of fighters in the Russian army in Ukraine come from the Far East, the Tuvans, Buryatis, Yakutis, and so on. They seem to be filling the ranks in disproportionate numbers compared with ethnic Slavs, ethnic Russians, essentially. And that generates resentments as well. Again, in the United States, we had a disproportionate number of African-American and other minorities who were fighting in Vietnam, and that had impact on our social fabric back home. And so we see that playing out in Russia today, where resentment seems to be building up in some of these republics that are bearing an outsized burden of the fighting. So we have to take that into consideration.
And this leads us very interestingly onto that topic of the sort of foreign impact. Sort of you have the sort of the ex-Soviet states which gained independence in the 90s. Russia has, over the last 3 decades, tried to reimpose its control numerous times on many of those states, and to an extent that's what's playing out at the moment in Ukraine. As you say, some states like Georgia swing between opposition to Moscow, getting closer to NATO and Europe, and then they swing back a little bit. And we're seeing that in Georgia at the moment. I think we'll come on to that in a minute, because the Georgian government is a little bit out of whack with its own people in that they are appeasing Moscow at the moment. But there's a big difference, isn't there, between those states that have had a taste of independence or semi-independence and the republics within Russia that have those native populations. Because there's lots of talk about Russia's going to disintegrate and Buryatia and all they're going to become independent countries. But actually, the level of control, the level of brainwashing, the lack of a sense of local identity that's been expunged by the Soviet Union, we're looking at a very different kind of equation, aren't we, if you compare Georgia to Buryatia?
I suppose, but in my recent trip to Georgia, what I found was that they, as with other ex-Soviet states, the Baltic states and Eastern Europe and so on, they powerfully identify with the West. They regard themselves as Europeans. They have an application in with the European Union to join, as well as with NATO. And they are, the broad population is very fervent about aligning themselves closer with the West and building security guarantees vis-a-vis Russia. So yes, you do see that. But as far as, the future of the Russian Federation, I mean, we have to consider this is a nation of nations, if you will. Unlike immigrant countries like the United States, Australia, Canada, and so on, they're not an amalgam, a mix of ethnicities all living together and intermarrying. No, they're nations, separate nations that have been cobbled together by force and coercion, usually over the centuries. So you have the strong national feelings that are growing almost by the day. I think that we have to consider the scenarios that might impact this, the future of the integrity of the Russian Federation. And I see three scenarios. One is, let's say, the German post-war German scenario, where after the defeat of the Third Reich, the German population went through a period of trauma, shock, and then self-healing. And then obviously clearly built themselves into a modern democratic state. I don't see that happening in Russia necessarily, because there's no traditional rule of law and civil society is stunted at best. So they really don't have the foundations to build on that. The second scenario would be North Korea, where let's say they lose their war against Ukraine, which has always been a westernizing influence historically on Russia. And so Ukraine is completely separated and joined with the West, which leaves the rest of Russia more as an Eastern-oriented nation. But in any case, in that scenario, if it's a North Korean scenario, what they do is retract, draw back into a cocoon, and engage in an autarky, self-sufficiency and belligerence. And that could go on for decades, even centuries. And the third dire scenario would be that of Somalia, where the entire fabric of Russian society just falls apart in the wake of a defeat in Ukraine and presumably Putin's downfall. And in that kind of scenario, what you would have is a breakup of the country into these various national groups, and basically areas controlled by criminals and guerrilla gangs in tandem with mafia groups and so on. That is very destabilizing, very worrying. I'm not predicting that's going to happen, but we have to look at all possibilities. And that's one of them. And given the fact that Russia is a nuclear power, that makes things even more volatile. So what's this? What kind of impact could this have on these nationalities? Well, already we're seeing more agitation among the various regions of Russia for more autonomy, more reaction, more resentment to the fact, as I said before, that their men are dying in larger numbers in Ukraine. And in fact, even with the current structures that Moscow has set up with what they call the near abroad nations, that's falling apart. That's fraying. The CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization. I mean, we're seeing fissures between Moscow and Kazakhstan, Moscow and Kyrgyzstan, Moscow and Armenia, to the point where a couple of these states are refusing to cooperate further with Russia. And then the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Eurasian group that they set up, all of these are fraying. They didn't have much to glue them together in the first place. So all of these forces, I think, are in slow play, where if you watch watch things closely, as you do and I do inside Russia, we see a slow motion train wreck in progress, which may also entail centrifugal forces that could cause the Russian Federation to fall apart. So some scholars call this the second war of the succession, second war of succession of the USSR. So 1991 was the first one, with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the independence of quite a number of states. And the second one we could be seeing playing out now.
And succession is an interesting, succession is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because essentially the violence we're seeing at the moment, the coercion, I mean, you have the underlying sort of imperial motive, absolutely, but the almost, I would say, irrational by our judgment war that Putin's unleashed, that is a direct result of not actually having a mechanism for a peaceful succession of power in the country. You've got an aging autocrat who, to shore up his popularity, has engaged in what he thought was going to be a quick and victorious war. And it's directly because there is no mechanism to replace leaders, to bring in fresh blood, to prevent this kind of extreme act happening. I think succession is at the heart of it.
Well, I once published an article called "How I Miss the Soviet Union." And the thrust of that article, and I make this argument sometimes, as well as other experts in foreign affairs, at least back in the day, during the days of the Soviet Union, there was a structure in place, Politburo, Central Committee, the party, and so on, and they actually had something approximating a succession procedure. And we saw that in 1964 when Khrushchev was thrown out of power. And I remember in the State Department and in the intelligence agencies, us nerds, if you will, used to parse who was in line of succession, who was ahead, who was behind, et cetera, et cetera. At least we had something to sink our teeth into. We don't today. You're right. You're absolutely correct. Putin has constructed a vertical power system where everything devolves on him. And that's very dangerous, and it's brittle. That's what it boils down to. So should he pass from the scene tomorrow, and for whatever reason, who knows what the succession is? Basically, the Russia today is a criminal organization with in alliance with the Siloviki being the security apparatus, a pretty rotten system. It's like the Gestapo and the mafia being aligned to hold power. And one has to wonder, really, with an educated, more traveled Russian population, how long the Russian people want to put up with something like that.
I think it was one of my guests, I think it might have been Luke Harding, who said, if you want to know what's going to happen in Russia, don't read any books on sort of political economy or philosophy. Read Mario Puzo's The Godfather, because that's going to,
I think that's right. And then we always go back to Churchill's famous remark about Russia. It's a riddle wrapped in a mystery and an enigma, and that hasn't changed at all. And basically, we're dealing with a country not terribly different in many ways than developing countries that have not had the benefit of centuries of building civil society institutions, rule of law, and that sort of thing. So it's unlike the Republic of the Congo or someplace like that, we're talking about a country with nuclear missiles and closer to Western security than some of these other countries. So it's something to keep us up at night, trying to contemplate the various scenarios.
I think people forget that Russia, neither went through the Renaissance nor through the Reformation. I mean, it hasn't had a period where power has been challenged by any particular class interest. And you see that at the moment, apart from the FSB, which, I put this theory to someone who ought to know, Yuri Felshchinsky, does the FSB form the only sort of class consciousness in Russia? And he was like, wasn't quite sure about that. But in essence, that's the only group in society that seem to have a common sense of purpose, and they control and own the entire show.
Well, again, it's a Mario Puzo scenario or outlook. I have great respect for the Russian people and for the Russian culture, but I always think back to when I study their politics. I hearken back to General George S. Patton during World War II. He remarked to an official from the Roosevelt administration that the Russians are recently civilized Mongol bandits. And of course, that's hyperbole and overstatement. But what he was saying is that this is a culture and a society that has not evolved to the level of the rest of Europe. And again, if Ukraine has lost that westernizing influence that Ukraine historically has exercised on Russian society, that will go away. And some Russia experts I've read say that we can expect Russia to really be pulled more in the easterly direction, sort of relying on the traditions of Tatar and Mongol cultures that also influenced Russian society over there. So these are things that spin in our heads and we have to think about, but certainly we cannot predict the future.
And it goes against, doesn't it? I mean, if we look at the oligarchs who generally, haven't really spoken out, but if we look at their lifestyles, which are very much based on Western opulence, villas in Italy, yachts, etc., they may use this line that they are oriented towards the East, but in their behavior and their lifestyle, they very much align with Europe. So it's a difficult circle to square, isn't it?
It is, but we cannot overestimate the impact that oligarchs have on Russian society in a cultural sense, or how deeply rooted they are in Russian society. Again, look at the United Kingdom, the United States. We of the creative class, if you will, we university educated people tend to flock together, and we often fall into the trap of an echo chamber where we're talking with each other about esoteric things that the rest of the population doesn't get involved with. So in the UK, the outcome is Brexit. And you had great swaths of British society who are not of the class that you and I are, and saw no benefit of that. And populism very much had a role in that. The same thing in the United States. I keep reminding my wife that I said, here we are, we're talking to each other and to our friends about how crazy things are in Washington and everything, but you cannot lose sight of our neighbors who have a very different outlook. They're working class and so on and so forth. The point I'm getting at is the same thing applies to Russia. Vast swaths of society do not have yachts. They do not travel abroad. They and their kids are not highly educated. They actually admire Putin for his strongman tactics. You cannot lose sight of who in society or what society is made up of in terms of broad populist appeal.
And it's an interesting question. I mean, it's impossible to have real sociology in a dictatorship. Nonetheless, there are some interesting pieces of research that are coming out. One of those, which I'm going to be debating a little bit later with another guest, is the survey that has consistently shown since about March, around 34% of the urban Russian population feel culpable for the aggression that's been inflicted on Ukraine. And the sort of corollary of that is that the majority don't. And of course, a great amount of horror has been expressed on social media. I actually thought that 34% is relatively high. It's above the threshold you would require in another country for a revolution of some sort. I don't believe that will happen in Russia because flight over fight seems to be the sort of psychology of those who oppose the regime. But I thought that was still quite fascinating that, some awareness of Russia's actions does seem to be filtering through. But as you say, it probably there's a big difference between, the urban and the rural class, probably a big difference between, the university educated and not. And demographically, again, there'll be a big difference between those who are, above 50 and below.
Well, that's very true. And I think we have to keep in mind a couple of things. One is that, first of all, there's much more information that flows through Russian society than in the pre-digital period. For example, when I worked on Afghanistan with the U.S. government, there was no internet, there were no emails, this kind of thing. One of the key channels for free flow of information is the Telegram social media platform, which is very popular with Russians. And so what I find fascinating is you have these bloggers, Russian bloggers who have hundreds of thousands of followers on Telegram and who report on the real situation in Ukraine, even though they're pro-Putin, many of them. They feel it's important to expose the weaknesses of the Russian military. Why? Because Russian men are getting slaughtered. And people want to know about this because these are their brothers, fathers, cousins, and so on. And the other thing is, the Ukrainian intelligence has been ballyhooing information they claim to have that very soon Putin is going to start up another mobilization. They claim this time of 500,000 men. Now, if that's true, and let me add one more thing. According to the Ukrainians, this will, unlike previously, this will entail closing the borders so that these young Russian men will not be able to flee the country. What happens when you bottle up that kind of pressure, that kind of thing going on with people who don't want to engage in this fight? They can't leave now. They would not be able to. So in any case, if that does happen, that's something to watch closely, because what Putin would be doing if he closes the border is to be bottling up social pressures, which could then build up. Not to mention the fact that they're so incompetent, the military scholars assert that they would not be able to pull this kind of mobilization off in any kind of effective way. So we have to keep an eye on that. And so it gets back to what we've been discussing throughout this session, and that is the slow buildup of social pressures inside Russia. We saw this with Afghanistan in the 80s. Well, we're seeing it now, but we're seeing it on a more intense basis. 100,000 casualties. Sanction. The price of Urals oil is now down to $40, in large part due to the sanctions, the cap, the price cap that the West has imposed on Russian petroleum. And $40 is barely the replacement rate. It's the production rate. It takes $40 to pull a barrel of oil out of the ground. Now, what I'm getting at is the economic sanction pressures added to the body bags coming back home, added to the degradation in people's daily economic lives over time, that has to build up. And even in an autocratic state like Russia, it's going to have an impact. Something's got to give. It's got to break. I'm very confident about that.
And of course, we saw this in the 90s. That was the period where I was sort of traveling around there. And you had, I would say, similar social conditions in that people would, they'd take time off work. They'd go at the weekends to their dachas so they could grow food. Large chunks of the economy moved to subsistence. You even had villages, which I visited, where they'd moved away from money economy. It had moved to a purely barter basis. That was the total collapse of the Russian economy in the 90s. But people might have bemoaned the loss of empire. They might have bemoaned all sorts of things, their youth and their rose-tinted spectacles of the Soviet Union. But there was also a kind of hope that things would get better. And I think that's why you didn't see, large-scale social disruption at that point, because no matter how bad it got, you had the traditional sort of, not indifference, but you know what I mean? You had the traditional indolence of the Russian population who don't take political action, don't organize, don't self-organize in the way that we see Ukrainians have. But at the same time, there was some kind of hope that things might improve. At this point, they've actually gone through that. Things did improve, and those things have been lost. Things that people had have been taken away from them. And that's a sort of similar dynamic you saw in the French Revolution, I think. It's not that people who are utterly bereft and poverty-stricken will suddenly rise up. That doesn't happen. It's where people have had something and it's been taken away. That's when you get the real sort of anger. So do you think we're getting to that point?
I think the center of gravity, to use a military term, in other words, the fulcral point where things will break in the power structure in Russia, will center not on as you say, the general population, but rather on the security elite and secondarily the oligarchs. Why? Because this is not a democratic society where grassroots sentiments make their way to the top, to the politicians. No, and the Russians, as you again correctly point out, have centuries-long, millennial-long traditions of being fatalistic to power. So I think it's going to come to the point where the Siloviki, the security elite, will among themselves decide that they've had enough in tandem with their oligarch pals. And these relationships are quasi-criminal. And eventually that's got to play, once they smell blood, like sharks in the water, they'll go after Putin. I don't care. People say, oh, he's got this Rosgvardia, the National Guard that he built, 250,000 men. They'll protect him. I mean, how many times have we seen this before? Iran, Nicaragua, Libya, I mean, you name it, on and on. Dictators who built up these fug-laden apparatuses to protect themselves. If the security elite decide they've had enough, that their core interests are in danger, and in this case, that centers on their economic, financial wherewithal, their condition. All of that apparatus just melts away like butter, and the dictator finds himself either in jail or worse. And I could see that happening here. Why should Russia be any different from any other autocratic state where things have gone bad? And so the center of gravity really centers on the Siloviki, and then secondarily with the oligarchs.
I would say more so in Russia, because the mechanic that drives people's judgment, and I talked about this with my recent speakers. Whereas in other societies there'll be different sort of mechanisms in people's brains of how they judge, somebody that they've come into contact with for the first time. It could be accent, it could be how they're dressed, it could be education, class. There are many criteria which people will use. I think my analogy was quite simplistic because it upset quite a few people, but there are a number of criteria. In Russia, it is fundamentally power. And that equation that people will be going on in their heads is, is this person a threat to me? Does he have more power than me? Is he likely to wield that power? And that, they'll be sensitive to that kind of dynamic. If it's not a powerful person, other things will kick in. That exists in everyone's heads. So the moment Putin is weak, it's not that people are going to stand by him. There'll be a tripping point where everyone will try to align to whoever they sense to be the strong man, the strongest, force in that new emergent society. Probably somebody, who's also nasty and thuggish. But naturally, I think people will just have this trigger or this switch that will just flick allegiance extremely quickly.
And that is what I think is going to happen at some point. I think, one little surface indicator of this, which is a very mystifying one at this point, but I think it gives us some indication of behind the scenes maneuvering that's been going on, is this unending series of murders of these billionaires.
I was going to ask that. That was exactly my next question.
Well, great minds think alike, that. But these oligarchs who have been falling out of windows, dying from a cup of tea, drowning in the pools, and so on. In fact, I remember when I was in Berlin a few years ago, there was a case of a young man who fell out of the window of the Russian embassy, and he was apparently an SVR agent. He was the son of an SVR officer. He fell out of the window out of the damn embassy. How blatant can that be? In any case, that's continued all along. The most recent case I recall is a sausage magnate billionaire who fell out of the window of his hotel in New Delhi, along with several of his associates, business associates. What's going on the surface? I think nobody really knows in the West what's going on, but I think the surface indicators are that there's some vying of power or suppressing of dissent that's going on, that where somebody at the top is having these people knocked off, or they're knocking each other off. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but it's something that continues to raise suspicion.
Well, I spoke to Edward Lucas about that, who, of course, was one of the first journalists in the world to question whether Putin is someone we should be doing business with. And he thought that many of these are almost certainly groups vying for ever scarcer resources. But no doubt there will also be a political angle in some of them. We can't really sort of tell at this point which is which. More mysterious, it seems to me, in fact, because oligarchs dying is not that mysterious in the context of the 90s. And I remember walking through a graveyard. It's a bit macabre. I walked through a graveyard in the 90s in St. Petersburg, and just the sheer quantity of new graves of people who were under the age of 30. Because normally you walk into a graveyard and everyone's, 70, 80, 90. But there are fresh graves everywhere of people in a fairly young demographic. And that was a sign of the mafia turf wars in the 90s that were playing out in St. Petersburg. But more mysterious for me is the amount of fires, maybe not so much in the conscription offices, because there's an obvious connection there between sort of, random political violence, really. But there's been a huge number of fires of shopping centers, warehouses, strategically important military research stations, or even anything associated with the state. And this speaks to me to an extraordinary thing that's really been unknown perhaps since the 50s, and that is sort of ground up chaotic terror or violence, a nihilistic violence by elements of the Russian population.
Yeah, and I really have nothing to add to that, other than that I think I would lump that together with the billionaires falling out of windows and so on. There's something going on. beneath the surface. It's like fishing, for example. I mean, a fisherman looks at the surface conditions of the water to try to determine where's the best fishing spot is, for example, or something like that. But so all we can do is read the tea leaves to mix metaphors and guess, because I've yet to see anything or hear anything from any of the true blue Russia scholars as to what's really going on here. But I think there's got to be some kind of the same dynamic is connecting the two. Oligarchs dying young and a lot sometimes with their entire families, and this kind of terrorism or whatever that's going on inside Russia. One day I hope we'll find out, but right now I don't think anybody.
I mean, it's unique, isn't it? I mean, we haven't seen this in our lifetimes, really.
Fascinating. It's fascinating. Also, then it gets back to the political element of, if there's enough of this going on, when will people start concluding that that Putin is losing his grip? That, he can't control Ukraine. We're losing thousands of our men there. And at the same time, he can't keep order at home. At some point, you think that that would also have an impact on people's attitudes and their feelings towards him.
Well, I've got two questions because I know your time is incredibly precious. There's two more questions I'd like to sort of throw at you. One is, not so much what's going to happen next in Russia, but who is more likely to take over. And then we'll turn back to Georgia and the destabilizing effect of so many Russians and how many of them will actually go back. We think that a lot of the Ukrainians abroad will go back to help rebuild their country, but then Ukraine has an idea to fall in behind. It has a national identity. But let's tackle that question of Russia first, because you mentioned the military telegram channels. You mentioned many people who would be, I would say, extreme nationalistic. And it seems that the most active groupings at the moment, whether they're quasi-governmental or supportive of the government, or, as you say, critical of the government, but for fairly horrific reasons, it's unlikely, isn't it, that the liberal opposition are going to take charge? Because what we've got in this mafia state is an extraordinary amalgam of mafia and the Gestapo, which is the sort of, you've got the SVR, the FSB, you've got the Siloviki. The liberal opposition, who are extremely Western in their education and outlook. I mean, I don't know what your sense is, but they just don't have the thuggery to take on.
No. So let me tell you a little bit about the good guys. I've been in touch with two expat Russian groupings on this. One is the Congress of People's Deputies, and the other is the League of Free Nations, I think they call themselves. They have different approaches to a post-Russia reconstructed state, but they tend to be, as you alluded to, educated, liberally oriented, and they're very idealistic. So we're talking about the Navalny, Kara-Murza groups, these kinds of people. Again, these are not these people don't necessarily capture the souls of Russian rednecks, but they do of the thinking of the creative class. I guess what I'm getting at is I'm watching these, I'm trying to get to know them better, and it's worthwhile for others to reach out to them. Because they may play a role in a post-Putin Russia. It's very possible that they could constitute the diaspora that are leaders of a returning diaspora, these 500,000 draft dodgers who I think want to go home. Most of them don't want to stay outside of Russia. And they could have an outsized impact on the future of Russia because they are the creative thinkers. They are the ones who are leaders. They are the dynamic people in their own groups and their own societies. So it's worth keeping an eye on these the diaspora. That there is agitation going on, They don't have much way of influencing current events, but they could in a Somalia situation that I described, where Russia breaks up into ethnic nation states and so on. These people could have a very outsized voice in how Russia itself progresses. Regarding Georgia, you had a question on Georgia.
Yeah, the last question was Georgia, and it was about this huge influx of people. Many, as you say, are the similar kind of highly educated, sort of more liberal part of the population. Some of them will have access to reasonable amounts of wealth. The question really is, how much of a deforming impact are they going to have on Georgian society, but also places like Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, especially if they don't go back? If Russia descends into some kind of chaotic scenario or an extreme nationalistic dictatorship, it's difficult to see these people actually going back in the near to midterm.
Kazakhstan and Georgia both have an open door policy for these men, and which is great for these guys who are escaping mobilization, but not very good for the local population. So, in the case of Kazakhstan, I've read in the press that whereas the Kazakhs are exercising their traditional hospitality, they're renowned for that. Nonetheless, tensions are building, and some resentments are building. In Georgia, where I was, as I said, I found people were among the younger set in particular, that the Russians are despised, and it's as much to do with ethnic and historical dynamics as to other factors. But again, as with the Baltic states, who inherited upon their independence a large Russian minorities who are citizens of those nations, but are not trusted necessarily. In Georgia, they fear the same kind of thing could play out, where over the years to come, that these people, these Russian exiles, do not return, and then they exercise a disproportionate impact on their country, on the Georgian society, again, which is under 4 million people. So they worry about that, and I would say, if a poll were taken, and maybe there has been one, the vast majority of Georgians disagree with their government's policy of open door. They want to see the door slammed shut. That's how they feel. So that's something to keep an eye on in these countries.
And a certain degree of appeasement, I would say, as well. I mean, one of the issues this week was that Ukraine lent a number of, I think, Patriot batteries to Georgia to help it defend against Russian aggression. And the Georgian government refuses to hand those back as a nod to Russia. That was one commentator's interpretation of it. So they're treading quite a fine line, aren't they?
Well, they are. I mean, I found that the party in power in Tbilisi is the Dream, the Dream Party, and they've been walking a sort of a tightrope policy-wise vis-a-vis Russia. They don't want to antagonize Russia, so they go out of their way not to do so, and including with this open trade. They don't engage in sanctions. But again, among the Georgian population as a whole, I mean, I met a lot of people. This government is not popular because of that. And I mean, it gets into complexities that we don't want to get into here, but you find this disconnect between government policy and the general sentiments of the population. And it centers around Russia and Russians. And it's something that's going to have to play out over time. We don't know where it's going.
And do people feel any sympathy for Saakashvili, who is under arrest?
I just had some communication with a think tanker in Tbilisi about Mikhail Saakashvili, who is this visionary dynamic leader took office in the early 2000s and really transformed the country in many ways, including democratically. In any case, reports are he's on his deathbed. People view him, the European Union has classified him as a political prisoner. And there are calls now that from the West, including from the United States, to pressure the government in Tbilisi to release him, let him live out his last days in peace. We'll see how that goes. He has a mixed popularity in Georgia. I didn't find him to be a rallying point by any means, but he was admired to some extent, to a large extent.
Well, James, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating to hear your view of someone who's been on the ground. And that's something we definitely want to do more of. As I say, last week I spoke to a correspondent who's been in Moscow. And I think those sort of first-hand accounts of what's going on, people who've actually been able to speak to people on the ground, is incredibly important at a time like this. And I'm hugely appreciative that you've spent so much time sort of sharing your thoughts with us and your impressions.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm always glad to return to continue the conversation. Thanks.